Hello, my name is Barbara Foreman. I'm here with my colleagues Kevin Smith and Lori Lee from the Regional Educational Laboratory Southeast. We are collaborating with the South Carolina Department of Education in creating webinars for their multi-tiered system of support plan. The current webinar is focusing on three-tiered instructional interventions. We are funded by the Institute of Educational Sciences and the U.S. Department of Education, and our federal contract requires us to say that you don't have to take our recommendations. These are just recommendations from the research base. On this slide, you see a picture of the three-tier model with academic systems of RTI on the left side and behavioral systems from MTSS on the right side. This picture is from your MTSS document in South Carolina, adapted from OSEP's Technical Assistance Center. And it's important to notice that the percentages of students that are expected to be served under each tier, with Tier 1 as being the key for serving the vast majority of students so that you can afford to actually have Tier 2 and Tier 3. If you have to serve everybody under intervention, you will not have the resources to do that. In this next slide, we also see a picture of the three tiers of support and the suggestion that the enhanced general education classroom instruction be at least 90 minutes uninterrupted. And then small groups for secondary intervention. This can be push in the classroom, an extra intervention time added to the ELA block for 30 minutes. And it can also be a small group pull-out intervention. And tertiary intervention is typically where special education enters the picture. And this intervention increases in intensity and duration. It is remedial, meaning that you may need a different program for this because students who are below the 30th percentile are more than a year behind, so that it's difficult to catch them up to what's happening in the classroom, like is often the goal of Tier 2, which can be thought of as a double dose of instruction. So we already talked about the importance of differentiating Tier 1 and having a core reading program. The second tier is typically small group pull-out, but it could be an additional dose in the classroom. Research has shown that small group intervention can be just as effective as one-on-one, but to do that, you really need to make sure to emphasize the word small. It really can't be more than 3 to 4 students in a group if you're going to be effective. And also you need to put the groups together mindfully for their academic achievement and their social dynamics so that the focus of the small group can be instruction and not behavioral disruptions. And the content of Tier 2, as I said before, can be the same as that in the classroom, a double dose, if you will. And the focus is typically on explicit instruction in the alphabetic principle, reading for meaning, and providing additional practice. So Tier 3 is typically special education, but it can represent more intense tutoring in general education. And as I said before, the content's often different from the first two tiers because students are more than a year behind at this point. Response to instruction should be part of the criteria for determining the eligibility for special education and also the movement within the tiers. If students are responding well, you might be able to move them up to Tier 2. And you want to make sure that you use data to make these placement decisions rather than guessing. Tier 3 is typically special.
This is Kevin Smith in the REL Southeast. As Dr. Foreman just mentioned a moment ago, it's critical that Tier 1 classroom instruction meets the needs of 80 to 90% of students in reaching grade level proficiency. Again, if that's not there, if you have to instruct too many students in intervention, you just won't have the resources to provide that. And again, this is straight from the South Carolina MTSS framework and guidance document. Again, we have to do all we can to make sure that all or as many as possible of our students are meeting grade level standards. So what should high quality literacy instruction look like? Really, it's making sure that it's evidence-based and it results in proficient reading in all students. How do you do that? So you want to build teacher knowledge and skills. Make sure that teachers coming into the field have solid knowledge of exactly how to provide excellent instruction. They have the skills to provide instruction for students that's beneficial, that meets their needs. And again, for those students, as they're going through instruction, the teachers need to make sure that they're first very explicitly modeling instructional practices for students, then working with students to make sure that they, again, understand how to use those skills, and then that gradual release of responsibility so that students are doing the work on their own. Of course, you need to differentiate instruction based on student needs, making sure that you don't just have rotations within your classroom, but that you actually have instruction that's different, that classroom routines occur and are consistent for students, that they're predictable, and that as students move into small groups or independent work, that they know exactly what they're supposed to do. So what are some strategies for making sure that the differentiation of instruction occurs? Well, if students, at least 2/3 of students need to learn the same thing, then you probably just need to go ahead and teach it to the whole group. Again, within that, if you have students who don't know something that many students do, then you want to try to place that within small group work. There are great student center activities that can be used in working with those small groups. The Florida Center for Reading Research has many student center activities that can be used for that purpose. Also, partner work can be great, and peer-assisted learning strategies is one way to do that. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And of course, independent work. So the point of this is making sure that every student has something that they can do on their own or through teacher-guided instruction, so that within your class you have, again, some students working with the teacher, some instruction occurring whole group, some small group, and some independently. So a little bit more about peer-assisted learning strategies. It can really be a great supplement to core reading, and PALS, or peer-assisted learning strategies, has helped many students in grades kindergarten through 6th grade improve phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, and comprehension. So the idea behind this is that teachers would take a student who knows the strategy well, they are proficient with that instruction, and they pair that with a student who may be a lower performing reader, who may need to work on that same skill, and then train students to follow the standard PALS procedures. It's a great way to give students practice time and opportunities to respond in that one-on-one environment where you have a mentor student who's being led, again, through these strategies and providing help for students who need more assistance. It can offer structured and reciprocal practice on, again, phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, and comprehension, and can be a great way to do that. And several studies have shown this to be an effective model.
There are a number of practice guides related to literacy on the What Works Clearinghouse website. And you see that these are designed for teachers of various ages of learners. We have some that are designed for teachers of younger learners, some for teachers of older learners, and then those that work with special populations. The practice guides were developed by panels of experts in the field, and they contain recommendations for teachers. They contain activities to utilize in classrooms that support those recommendations, and they also contain potential obstacles that teachers might encounter, as well as suggestions for overcoming those obstacles. There are this particular practice guide on the foundational reading skills was developed by a panel that was chaired by Dr. Foreman. You can access this practice guide at the website listed on the slide, and we are going to be reviewing the recommendations that are presented in this practice guide. You'll find these themes that are reflected throughout the practice guide. First of all, the guide confirmed the National Reading Panel's findings on effectiveness of instruction in alphabetics, fluency, and comprehension. And then this practice guide emphasizes the importance of oral language instruction and definitely encourages the integration of reading and language skills.
As panel chair, I put together the panel members of researchers and practitioners in early reading and language development, as you see named on the slide. This practice guide picks up where the National Reading Panel left off. That National Reading Panel came out in 2000 and reviewed 20 years of prior research. This practice guide picked up from 2000 through to when it was published in 2016, and it started by reviewing 4,500 citations in K-3 reading and winnowed that down through the rigorous criteria from the What Works Clearinghouse to 56 studies that met the design standards. The recommendations in this practice guide for instruction and foundational reading skills, grades K-3, are listed on this slide. There are 4 recommendations. The first one has to do with teaching of academic language skills, and you'll notice that there was a minimal level of evidence for that recommendation. Minimal level of evidence doesn't mean it's not important. In this case, it was regarded as very important by the panel. It's just that there wasn't a lot of rigorous research available on academic language. So this is a shout out to researchers to do more research in this critically important area. Recommendations 2 and 3 have strong evidence. There's been a lot of research in these areas. Recommendation 2 is to develop awareness of the segments of sounds in speech, which is phonological awareness, and the link of phonological awareness to letters. And of course, when you're talking about letters, phonological awareness is at the level of the phoneme, so people use the term phonemic awareness. Recommendation 3 is teaching students to decode words, analyze word parts, and word parts are the morphemes, minimal units of meanings, such as prefixes and suffixes, and to write and recognize words. And then the last recommendation is to practice all of the above in connected text every day to support reading accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. These 4 recommendations cover a developmental time span that is depicted on this slide. So academic language, recommendation 1, covers K-3. In fact, we really emphasize it starting earlier in pre-kindergarten. Recommendation 2, which is phonological awareness and linked to letters, starts in kindergarten. Of course, it could start in pre-K with clapping to syllables, but in kindergarten you move from the syllable to the onset rhyme, which is the medial beginning phoneme or phonemes in a word, and the medial vowel and remaining consonant. Onset rhyme, some people would call that the word family at the end of the word, to the phoneme level. And we have this fading out at the end of grade 1. You only need to pursue phonological awareness if you're working in remediation with an older reader who is really struggling with segmenting the sounds in speech and therefore has trouble linking up to letters. Recommendation 3 and 4 are starting in mid-kindergarten and going all the way through grade 3. So academic language, this is a term that may be new for many people. It's basically the formal communication structure and words that are common in books and at school. We don't tend to talk the way that written texts are written. If we did, people might fall asleep. For example, Stanovich says the word occasionally is very common in 3rd grade text, but very rare in oral language. So academic language skills, then, are the skills that enable students to use and comprehend academic language. And in this slide, the Categories of academic language are divided into academic vocabulary, which people are quite familiar with that idea, narrative language skills, which also we tend to do a pretty good job of that, working with children to clearly relate a series of events like story, grammar, the plot, the sequence, main idea, details. But inferential language may be less familiar. That's the ability to discuss topics beyond the immediate context. I like to think of it as using language to think about things, to make inferences. Now, academic vocabulary is also the ability to use the words and grammatical structures common to formal language. So that grammatical structures include such things as compound sentences, subordinate clauses, adverbial clauses, prepositional phrases, and the other aspects of grammatical structures relevant to the discourse of written language are things like connective words, logical connectors like because, or temporal connectives like when, or adversatives like however, and then pronoun reference. That pronoun she refers to someone named in the previous sentences or paragraphs. Noun and verb phrases, nominalization. I'll give you an example of nominalization. If I read the sentence, when will self-driving cars be commercially available? This question is a hot topic in the media. What does the word this refer to? Often we have to reread the previous sentences to figure out what the referent is. All those aspects of discourse in written text can be taught and are part of academic language instruction.
Practice.
So in thinking about vocabulary, it's important to think about the dimensions of word knowledge that make vocabulary deeper. And Bill Nagy and Scott have the following dimensions of word knowledge that they list, and these can be taught. Knowledge of how to pronounce a word, how to spell the word, the grammatical behavior of the word, in other words, its syntax and morphological features, how that word co-occurs with other words, the frequency of the word, orally and in print, as I gave the example of occasionally, very frequent in print, but not so much orally. The stylistic register, whether it's academic language or the informal language of the home. Conceptual meaning, what are the antonyms and synonyms of the words? And what's the interrelatedness of this word with other words? All of this information is more like a thesaurus entry rather than just a dictionary entry. So the only way to make sure that more than about 300 words a year are learned, we have to figure out a way to make word learning more generative. And we can do that by thinking of these prefixes and suffixes that extend our base words and our root words to multiply our word knowledge. So I'm thinking,
As we look at recommendation 2, develop awareness of the segments of sound in speech and how they link to letters, there are some action steps that are associated with this recommendation. And what we'd like to do now is just share some activities that can support those action steps related to the recommendation. So you see action step 2, teach students letter-sound relations. And so one activity that can help in instruction of this particular action step is a card that looks like this one, where you have a memorable picture. In this case, we're looking at the letter P, and we see a cute little pig, and we see there is a pizza pie close to that pig. And then underneath the picture, you see a sentence that also contains many words associated with the letter P and that use the letter P. And so the sentence reads, the letter P is for pig, who is very pleasant when asking for pizza. Pig says, please, may I have some pizza? And so cards like this can be used to introduce the letters and the sounds to students. The next action step we want to look at is use word building and other activities to link students' knowledge of letter-sound relationships with phonemic awareness. And so this particular activity, we provide several letter tiles for the student, not too many so we don't get our students confused. And then the teacher makes a word. And in this particular case, the teacher has created the word fat. And then she or he would ask the student to make a new word. And instead of fat, the teacher asks the student to create the word fan. And so then the student is required to move the appropriate letter tile and replace it with one that creates the new word. And so you see the teacher then asks the student to make the word can, and then cat, and then back to fat. And so this is an activity that can help students begin to make words and be aware of those sounds and where they fall in the word that they're creating. And so as we move on and we look at recommendation 3, now we're teaching students to decode words and analyze those word parts and write and recognize words. And so an action step that is associated with this recommendation is instructing students in common sound spelling patterns. And so we've provided an activity here that can help in instruction of this. And so you see we're going to use some Elkonin boxes. And on the left, we're actually asking our students to write in those boxes. So they're going to represent the sounds of the word in the boxes. And so you see for the word tree, there are only 3 boxes there because that's the number of sounds that are represented in that word. However, the student then has to write the word and represent the sounds, even though more than one letter represents a sound. So with tree, you have a box for T, a box for R, and then there are the 2 E's represented in that final box. And then under tree, you see the word cake. And we see again 3 boxes where we're going to represent the sounds in the word cake. And then we see our letter E that's hanging out there with no box at all. And that's because we don't hear the E. So E doesn't get a box. And then finally you see the word shout. And again, we're representing the sounds in those boxes. And so the SH makes one sound, the OU creates another, and then the final T. So all of those sounds are represented in those boxes. So in this case, the students are actually writing in the boxes. To the right, you see with the activity that instead of actually writing, they're using letter tiles. So again, they're creating words. The letter tiles have multiple letters on them representing the sounds, and they're putting them together to create words.
So for recommendation 3, action step 3, which is teaching students to negotiate common word parts, we actually have a short video that we're going to share that will lead you through an activity that will present a way for teachers to help students with that specific action step.
About vocabulary.
Once students have learned a few common spelling patterns, show them how to analyze word parts. Breaking down words into smaller, meaningful word parts can enable young readers to effectively read more challenging words. In this activity, students practice combining affixes with words to build new words. Some word parts go at the end of the word and are called suffixes. Some suffixes make the word plural. Some suffixes change the action. Some suffixes change how words are used in a sentence. We can also add word parts before the base word to create new words. These word parts are called prefixes. Another activity that will reinforce students' familiarity with word parts is to make a morpheme web. For example, students draw a web with the root struct in the center. Around the center are prefixes with lines below them for words to be written. Students use as many prefixes as they can to create new words. This can be an individual or group activity. This same type of activity can be conducted using suffixes too. To extend this activity, students can circle the affixes in these words found in text. We were excited to see the bulldozer at the construction site because that meant that the deconstruction of the old building would begin.
It's important to think about the dimension.
Recommendation 4 is to ensure that each student reads connected text every day to support reading accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. In action step 1, and moving forward with that recommendation, we know that as students read orally, as teachers, we need to model strategies, we need to scaffold for them, and provide feedback so we can support their accurate and efficient word identification. So here are a few prompts for students to apply word reading strategies. For your less advanced readers, you may want to ask a question like, can you look for parts that you know within the word? And as a teacher, you'd want to point out known letter sounds, ones that you've taught before, sound spelling patterns, or rhyme patterns if the student does not recognize any. Again, as a teacher, you may need to point those out. You can also ask the very common question, can you sound that out for me? If the student has difficulty, again, you can prompt each step of that process as was shown in recommendation 3. And finally, for our less advanced readers, we may want to ask, check that. Does that make sense to you? And again, prompt the reader to reread the sentence as needed. For your more advanced readers, you might want to say something like, you know this word part. Say this part. Point to those familiar affixes that students need, for example, ing endings, or the first syllable of the word. Repeat for any additional parts or syllables as needed, and then say, now read the whole word. So that, again, hopefully provides some good ways for you to consider 3-tiered instructional intervention models to promote literacy success. We truly appreciate your time and attention. If you have any comments or questions, again, our emails are there right for you on the screen, and there's a website for you to visit, the REL Southeast as well. So thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.
From slide 5. Why is Tier 2 typically a pullout? This seems to contradict what we've been told in the past.
Right. So Tier 2 could be considered as push in the classroom or pull out. I think the important thing to think about with these tiers is don't get caught up in the tier language. Think about how far behind is this student or group of students relative to the classroom. Because remember, if they're at about the 35th percentile, they're 6 months behind. And 6 months behind you can handle in push in the classroom to do a double dose of what you're already teaching in the classroom. But below the 30th percentile, you're a year or more behind. And you start realizing that it's not a double dose of what you just taught. These students are so far behind, you need to catch them up. And so that's why I think often people think of Tier 2 as a pullout, because they're already doing some differentiation in the classroom, but these students who are more than a year behind really need something more intensive. And Tier 3 obviously is even more intensive. So I think you had another question about whether that's special education. So what's happening nationally is there's a movement, and I think Florida actually from the very beginning only had 3 tiers, and Tier 3 was special ed. So this varies state by state. And I think it all depends on the students you're dealing with, how far behind, how much their problems are developmentally so far behind that you don't want to delay special ed placement for students who really need it, and that they have developmental issues or are so reading disabled that they're years behind. Right? So years, and considering special education placement could mean inclusion, right? We're not necessarily talking about resource rooms, we're talking more about mainstreaming and inclusion. It's just, the question is, don't get caught up in the tier language. Think about what your students need, how far behind, how can we differentiate instruction for them in what location? And do they need a separate program because they're so far behind what's going on in the classroom that they need something that's much more explicit, much more intense in a pull-out manner. That's the way to think about it.
Okay.
You were worried you then had to test all students who were in Tier 3 for special education. No is the answer, but you need to think about what's the best placement for them.
So then as a follow-up question, should all students be served, and I know you say don't get caught up in the tier language, but should all students be served Tier 1, Tier 2, 10, 3? Should that instruction be intensified through all those different, before making the determination, I think this child might need to be tested?
My special ed colleagues will tell you, don't delay referral to special ed for students you know need it now. There's been a worry that the tier system is delaying referral to special ed. And remember, RTI came about because the old way of referring students to special ed was IQ achievement discrepancy. And you needed an achievement score, so they were waiting till third grade or above when they had the state test data to actually then give them an IQ test, look for a discrepancy. So kids were being served in special ed not till third grade and above. So the idea of RTI was prevention and early identification. So don't delay referral to special ed for students who really need it. Any developmental disability, if they have speech and language problems, get them help in that area, or serious behavioral problems. It's a judgment call for sure. I worked in schools in Florida. We grade our schools in Florida. There were DNF schools, and everybody in Tier 1 was way, way behind. And the students we serviced in Tier 2 were on average at the 10th percentile. So you see how these notions of where you are on the reading continuum can really vary depending on your district, your school context. So you have to think of the tiers in terms of the actual students that you're serving.
So would I be correct in saying that the tiers of instruction are not a pathway to special ed referral?
No, I think RTI is trying to say, let's see how students respond to instruction first. So, but there are going to be some students with serious developmental disabilities that they're not responding to instruction already. And you will refer them right away because they need it. But other students, may come to kindergarten not having the benefit of a highly literate household or pre-K. They look like they know nothing. No, let's see how they respond to quality instruction in kindergarten before you move them through the tiers. So start with the classroom, see how they respond, differentiate instruction, but a double dose within the core reading block isn't enough for that student. So get them some additional intensive intervention in a Tier 2. And then you decide in Tier 2, how are our students making progress? Look at their data. And then there may be some who need more intensity. Think of the Kennewick, Washington example, right? They were using those percentile ranks and thinking about the number of minutes and intensity of instruction for catch-up growth. So I think that's a good way to think about RTI in terms of, okay, how many minutes, what intensity, for how long?
Thank you.
Yeah.
It seems like phonics is really emphasized. What is the role of phonics in reading instruction?
I'm glad you asked this question. There's a lot of confusion about what phonics means. And phonics, from a research point of view, is teaching students how graphemes and phonemes connect, and how, in other words, how letters and the sound segments of speech connect. That's the alphabetic principle, and that's what phonics is about. Phonics is not a particular commercial vendor program. It's really about teaching our alphabetic system. But the value of systematic phonics instruction is improving decoding skill, which only indirectly improves comprehension by making decoding more accurate and eventually more efficient. Those indirect effects will only get you so far in terms of understanding complex text. Building children's proficiency in language and their knowledge of the world are important to the broader goal of improving reading comprehension. Thank you.
I'm wanting to know if a teacher has Tier 1 instruction for 90 minutes every day, then has an additional 30 minutes when she provides additional instruction to students that need it. Is this considered Tier 2 instruction?
Well, typically, if the teacher has an extra intervention time in her regular ELA instruction, that's not considered Tier 2. It's just built into the ELA block, and we encourage that so that the teacher can differentiate instruction for all students. However, if students are really far behind, like below the 30th percentile, they're usually then at least a year behind, then sort of a double dose of practicing what was taught in the classroom may not be sufficient for them. And so then a pullout. And sometimes a teacher may be able to teach that, but more likely it's going to be a specialist or other interventionist that is staffing that small group Tier 2 to be more explicit, more intensive for meeting the students' needs.
Okay, thank you. That clears that up.
Good. Mentions of word knowledge that make vocabulary deeper, and Bill Nagy and Scott have the following dimensions of word knowledge that they list, and these can be taught. Knowledge of how to pronounce a word, how to spell the word, the grammatical behavior of the word, in other words, its syntax and morphological features, how that word co-occurs with other words, the frequency of the word, orally and in print, as I gave the example of occasionally, very frequent in print, but not so much orally. The stylistic register, whether it's academic language or the informal language of the home. Conceptual meaning, what are the antonyms and synonyms of the words? And what's the interrelatedness of this word with other words? All of this information is more like a thesaurus entry rather than just a dictionary entry. So the only way to make sure that more than about 300 words a year are learned, we have to figure out a way to make word learning more generative. And we can do that by thinking of these prefixes and suffixes that extend our base words and our root words to multiply our word knowledge.
Guides related to literacy on the What Works Clearinghouse website. And you see that these are designed for teachers of various ages of learners. We have some that are designed for teachers of younger learners, some for teachers of older learners, and then those that work with special populations. The practice guides were developed by panels of experts in the field, and they contain recommendations for teachers. They contain activities to utilize in classrooms that support those recommendations, and they also contain potential obstacles that teachers might encounter, as well as suggestions for overcoming those obstacles.
But it can represent more intense tutoring in general education. And as I said before, the content's often different from the first two tiers because students are more than a year behind at this point. Response to instruction should be part of the criteria for determining the eligibility for special education and also the movement within the tiers. If students are responding well, you might be able to move them up to Tier 2. And you want to make sure that you use data to make these placement decisions rather than guessing. Talked about the importance of differentiating Tier 1 and having a core reading program. The second tier is typically small group pull-out, but it could be an additional dose in the classroom. Research has shown that small group intervention can be just as effective as one-on-one, but to do that, you really need to make sure to emphasize the word small. It really can't be more than 3 to 4 students in a group if you're going to be effective. And also you need to put the groups together mindfully for their academic achievement and their social dynamics so that the focus of the small group can be instruction and not behavioral disruptions. And the content of Tier 2, as I said before, can be the same as that in the classroom, a double dose, if you will. And the focus is typically on explicit instruction in the alphabetic principle, reading for meaning, and providing additional practice.